I'm going to give you a quick presentation only just to kind of get the bullet points so that we can talk about it. This is about a conversation regarding the importance of debriefing in canine operations. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pop this up. And so we in the best practices working group, we've been talking about this for a while, and we wanted to kind of fold this into a lot of the topics that we have right now. For example, California is facing a very serious threat to patrol dog operations with an Assembly Bill 742, which will severely curtail police canine operations. We'll probably get into that a bit deeper. But as a way of staving off such attacks, one of the things that we think is important just for doing our job right, doing better, is debriefing. And this approach to Kaizen debriefings is what we want to talk about. So they're absolutely a critical piece of what you do. Now, if anybody has military experience, you've been through hot washes. Debriefs and hot washes are slightly different. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about Kaizen and what it is. It's a very important approach that we need to consider. We'll talk about when and where to debrief, who's supposed to be involved, what a good debriefing should and shouldn't have, and a feedback model that is strictly binary in nature. So why do we do it? Why do we debrief? Because I don't care what you do, whether it works out the way you want or whether it didn't work out the way you want, every outcome yields information. And if you don't harness that information, then you're not making informed choices moving forward. So especially if you train the way you work and work the way you train, then what happens is the failures you have in training give you information about how better deploy when you actually do the work. So it's really critical that you consider your training to be just like an operation as often as you possibly can. Once you go through an event, there should be a hot wash. Hot washes are for the team. Basically, that's when the team gets in a room and they have a discussion, and what is said in the room stays in the room. It is only about the team operating. Formal debriefs that come after that are about individual choices and outcomes. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But in a debrief, you're really concerned with who did what, when, and where. You'll find out about the hows and whys later on. But the whole point about this is figuring out who had responsibility within the operation. The trade-offs that we have to consider when making tactical decisions. I'm a firm proponent of the tactical concepts model of time, distance, angles, and shielding. But we also have to consider, did we have resources? Did we have things available that could have made this better? Could we have called them? And what are the external impacts? How did this affect those who aren't a part of the team? And what do we do with it? It's said that most modern debriefing and police policy making is based on outcomes. An outcome didn't look good, so all of a sudden we have a new policy. And next thing you know, or outcome doesn't look good, and now we have new legislation. So the point about this is taking control of the outcomes by taking control of the process, getting better at how we do our jobs. As we go through this, we've got to realize that everything is a chance to improve. Everything we do. And the Japanese philosophy of Kaizen, Zen being away, Kai means to proceed. Everything we do is about seeking perfection, even though we know we can't get there, but always trying to improve and get better and better. Every challenge we face, everything that gets hard or seems impossible, we have to look at it and say, okay, if it's impossible, we keep it out of our repertoire. But if it's only impossible because we haven't built the skills for it or haven't put the resources into it, then that's something we can fix. And we have to decide every day what's fixable and what's not. Now, there are three kinds of debriefings that we want to consider. The cursory on scene one, that's the one where I, as a police supervisor, would be debriefed by my handler, who would give me a quick rundown of what happened. I would talk to another patrol supervisor on the scene, and then we would conduct our use of force investigation or whatever else needed to be done. They are about making sure that everybody's on the same page, making sure that we check all the boxes that are required of us by the department. Now, once that's done and the dust settles, it's time for the K9 unit to have an internal debrief. And those are after the reports are written, they use that information and identify, as they go through this, decision points, trade-offs, things that they could have done that, an opportunity they might have missed or one that was taken, and who was responsible for what when. Once that's completed, then the department can take that K9 internal brief and they can go ahead and assess performance against the policy. And they can make a decision about, did it comply with policy or not? Was it a best practice application or not? And then from there, we move on. I think that a good debriefing should include everybody involved in K9, from the officer involved to other officers peripherally involved, all the way up to the supervisor. And if it's a significant event, you get everybody in the unit in there so they can talk about it, but let the people who are actually involved lead the conversation. The others are there to listen with a critical ear, waiting to see what happens. And then if it's appropriate, you can have additional involved personnel, from patrol officers, patrol supervisors, dispatchers, you name it. They can all be a part of this as it's appropriate. And this is just like back in grammar school. Everything in a debrief should be the things that you're going to find in a good police report. Those 5 W's: who did what, when, and where. And you identify the hows and whys of those things by the trade-offs that people make. I'm a firm believer there's no such thing as good tactics or bad tactics for the most part, but it's trade-offs. And people will make trade-offs, sometimes mindfully, sometimes mindlessly. And we've got to identify those moments in which they make a trade-off. In other words, if they rush up to a car that they should actually wait and move on, then that's a mindless trade-off that's being made. And we have to build a culture of mindlessness. We have to build a culture that says we are going to deploy the way we train, and that we don't build training scars by rushing into things when we're in training. We teach everybody how to move, keep the team together, take advantage of the numbers, the times, distance, angles, and shieldings, all of those things. We take a look at the results, and we have our binary model that we talk about, which is there are 2 types of feedback about this. Is it affirming or is it adjusting? If it's affirming, it basically means we like that, we want to do more of it. If it's adjusting, it's all about what do we need to tweak to get ourselves back in the affirming zone. This is the way you need to think as a trainer, because you are a trainer. I don't care if you're a handler, a supervisor, or whatever, you're a trainer, because anytime you're with your dog, one of you is training the other. And if you don't make the decision at every moment to be the trainer, you are by default the trainee, because dogs have it way easier. They just have to figure out how to make the hairless monkey say good and give them stuff. But we've got all sorts of other things to consider. So as we're going through this, you are constantly looking for that affirming or adjusting feedback that you can go ahead and apply to yourself. You can share with others. The group can bring to you. It's all about those 2 things: affirm it or adjust it. And once we get that out of the way, it takes a lot of the pain and the sting out of a performance that didn't come out the way we want. But remember, every outcome, I tell the dog, I tell people about their dogs. If you're training and your dog does something you didn't expect, you gave them a cue, you gave them a command, and the dog did something different, that's information, because the dog can only perform to the level trained, period. So that means you just asked something you didn't prepare them to deliver yet. And we want to do the same thing at both ends of the leash: prepare to deliver. So to wrap this up and get to the conversation, because that's the important part of this, we have collective wisdom we want to share, and we have people in the audience we want to ask us questions so that we can see elements of this that maybe we missed. But I'm a firm believer that you debrief everything. Good, bad, and different doesn't matter. And you do it until debriefing is just a natural part of your process. It's just like breathing. You don't even think about it. You just do it. So that means you don't just do it for a while till you get good at it. You keep doing this. It goes on forever, because that's how you build this Kaizen culture of continual improvement. Remember, don't think about good and bad nearly as much as the trade-offs. I'm willing to give up maybe cover because I need to get an angle, or I give up an angle because I'm going to stay behind cover. Those are trade-offs that we make. When you figure out what works, affirm it, tell people this is what we're going to do, this is the way we'll do it, that's what you did, keep doing that, that's fine. And if it's not affirming, what do you need to tweak to get yourself back in the affirming zone? It's that simple. All right, that wraps up the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop that and stop presenting. And we're back to the group. All right, Don, the ball's in your court.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. I've got questions myself, but I'd like to defer to Lou first, and then Gene, for any comments about from their viewpoint on this, so we can get more of a conversation going with the rest.
Okay, well, thanks, Don. So listen, first off, I love spending an afternoon in New Hampshire talking dogs. Police K9 with such good people who know a lot of things. And I welcome this format, Don, especially because it encourages everybody who participates or who is watching to engage as well, to have a conversation, to ask questions, maybe pass on a lesson or two, or to add to Steve's slideshow with a comment or two. And I think it's important that professionals get together from time to time to have these type of discussions. So I thank that, and I look forward to these type of webinars. Second, I love that you're recording them, because I know that as many or as few that show up live, there are so many more that go to the YouTube channel and review the content of this, whether it's during their in-service training, their professional advancement type of training, or whatever, or they're just curious and they're looking at the YouTube video. Either way, they're getting the information. The only thing that we don't get from that type of viewership is their comments, right? Because they can't participate live and they can't ask the questions live and things like that. But I wanted to point out an important part of Steve's presentation, and that is the affirming part. You know, we're police officers, we have debriefs, we talk about how to do things better constantly, and that usually gets us to gravitate towards what could we have done better. So a lot of times debriefs often become a very negative experience, meaning we're pointing out errors that we want to improve upon in the future. It's like, you know, it's like grinding the weld so that we can weld it better the next time. You know, so we're grinding off all the stuff that we could have done better, only so that we can have space to apply a better weld in the next event to make that joint even stronger, or to make that call response even stronger. And I wanted to add this. I wanted to add the importance of the briefing itself, right? The briefing beforehand. You know, a lot of these things come into the briefing, but the part I wanted to talk about for the briefing is that make sure your briefing is in a safe area, right? Because a lot of times, not a lot of times, but I remember at least 5 instances where we had the briefing of a call and the bad guy was not 25 feet from us because the officer thought the person had run a greater distance away from the scene itself. And lo and behold, just within 50 yards or so was the bad guy listening to our briefing, really. So make sure that your briefing or your debriefing are in safe areas. But I want to leave with this question, Steve. You know, I would imagine that a lot of people have been involved in debriefings in some format or another. But I wanted to start with a question. You don't have to answer it right away because I know Gene's on deck. But what is the most common critique that you've been involved in? Like, what is the words that constantly come out of your mouth or out of a debriefing? For example, is it the perimeter was too tight or not good enough? Was it the communication could have been improved? I mean, what is, if there was one constant debriefing note, not a constant, but one frequent debriefing note, I'll give you some time to think about it. What do you think that debriefing note would be?
I'll let Gene answer, and I'll actually, while this is going on, I'll kind of type in a couple things in the chat about that.
Thanks, Lou. Gene?
Well, good afternoon, depending where you are. It's still morning here on the West Coast, wet and rainy. Well done, Steve. Again, I always learn a lot talking, listening to you, talking to you, and listening to the comments of everybody else. I appreciate it. I think given our current status, our current environment, debriefs have become more important than ever before. I think we need to ask the questions at the end of a canine situation. Even though we had the opportunity or had the right legally to bite someone, should we have? Was there another way we could have effected an arrest without having to use the dog to apprehend them through a use of force? On a critical situation where someone is seriously injured and you do a debrief and you're thinking, well, we may get sued over this, consider having your county attorney, your city attorney, your agency attorney present for that debrief, because then it would be protected by the attorney-client privilege, or at least we can raise a very good argument later on if during the deposition process in a civil lawsuit, they were to ask what was discussed at a debrief. At least we have a very good argument that it's protected by the attorney-client privilege if an attorney was there in anticipation of expected litigation. Then you can really get serious on that debrief about why things occurred, what went right, what can we do better next time. Generally speaking, I think canine units need to do a better job of debriefs. I know in the tactical world, our SWAT teams do very extensive debriefs on certain situations, and it could be as mundane as, yeah, we needed a ladder to get over the fence. Well, same could happen with canine. Did we have all the proper equipment that we needed? If we had had another tool, would have made it a little easier. That's a great opportunity to decide what equipment your unit may need, can borrow from a neighboring unit, or you need to buy on your own. Plus discuss the tactics and whether or not it does fall within the policy, and may even give you an opportunity to decide, does our policy need to be tweaked in any way given what just occurred? Particularly if it's an unusual circumstance, you want to make sure that you're always consistent with your policies and procedures. So I'm a big proponent of debriefs. We do it on our own legal cases. When we win a trial, lose a trial, we'll get together with our attorneys and talk about, okay, what can we do better next time? Different experts. What about this legal tactic? Should I have done it? Should I have done something differently? So yes, we all learn in our various professions how we can do our job better so that we're much more effective later on. So well done, Steve. Lou, thank you for your comments as well.
Thank you, Gene. I appreciate that. So my experience, are you ready, Steve? Did you want to comment?
I just posted a few things in the comments that I see in the in there. So, you know, things that I've heard in debriefing. A lot of times they'll talk about the start was contaminated. We had no containment, or the containment discipline broke down. We went too fast to maintain search team structure. We missed a chance to generate compliance. And the other biggie is if you actually have a bite that the dog didn't release as fast as it should. Those are the things that you got to look at, and you got to say, okay, what are we going to do about this moving forward?
Yeah,
and there are plenty others. I know the people in the audience will be able to come up with more. Type them in, folks. Type them in.
Yeah, if you want to say or ask a question or make a statement or talk at all, just there's a icon in the middle of your screen there with a hand. Just hit that, and we'll recognize you right away. But until they do, my history goes back to debriefs that started with 2 or 3 handlers without a trainer sitting in a restaurant trying to figure out what we just did in a practice session and how did it go, and everybody gives their views and how would we adjust to start right then and there to figure out whether you're doing it right, because not everyone has the availability of a trainer. And I came from an agency that had a trainer, but he only worked days at that time because we didn't have as many people. But we would discuss, I want to take my dog and I want to get him to do this. If I do these things to get him there, what are the pros and cons that could happen? And if there were more cons than pros, we didn't do it that way. So, and that is just a group discussion with people that were not trainers. But I think the emphasis that we're going to try to put to the membership and to people who listen to our YouTube videos, webinars, is that today more than ever, everyone has to try to get up to speed as soon as possible and have a working knowledge of how you want to train your dog or what's needed to train your dog. And when you deploy, especially when you deploy, have to look back, even if it's just you out there all by yourself and then you come back in, there was no one around, that you have to take a look at within yourself and say, boy, that was not good. Or that wasn't bad, but I made some mistakes here. I could have did this. And what were you thinking? You trained without ever practicing taking cover. So now you're out there and you need the cover and you didn't take it. And you could have been hurt. You could have been killed. So those are the kinds of things that you have to do within. I know back in my time, we did a lot of things at night in the dark. And if it was dangerous, it was call the canine unit. And I realized, and Steve is a big proponent of this because he talks about it all the time. I realized that I was silhouetting myself everywhere I went with a pack set radio that was going off or the flashlight was shining. And I learned, I took away from the actual training, I did tracks with my dog just to see if I could understand what he was doing, really pay attention. So at night, if I had to, I could shut the lights and the radio off and still understand what that dog was telling me that he was doing as he was going down the track. So there's a lot of things that we need to do. We need to talk about. You guys may have some of your own individual stories that will help. But we're really talking to you, and we're talking to the members of the USPCA. More importantly, we're reaching out to the members or people everywhere in the U.S. because this is a U.S. problem we have to try to fix. So that's where we're at. And those of you that were here earlier are just talking about different things, and we will probably talk a little bit about that as the video goes on. So anybody would like to say something, this is the time.
Steve, could you talk about the title, Kaizen, and what that represents? I didn't catch it at the beginning if you mentioned it, and I just wanted to make sure that, I mean, it's an important, I know what it means, right? But I think it's an important piece. It's kind of like a philosophy, and I just didn't know if you could kind of expound upon that a little bit.
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, Kaizen is the Japanese philosophy that says, that acknowledges that perfection is unattainable, but the continual pursuit of perfection through continual efforts to improve is a way of life. It should be a way of life. It is the way we live every moment of the day, not just when we're on the job. But we can bring the mindset and the commitment to continual improvement to what we do at work. There's actually an institute in Japan for Kaizen, to bringing it to life in many areas and disciplines. It was started by Masaki Imai, and it's a really powerful way to view the work that we do and improve it.
So broadening this out a little bit. So when we talk about debriefing and everything, and I think it goes always to the whole, like you said in the beginning, Steve, the whole team that's working actually the deployment with the dog. And then it's also everybody on the peripheral that's working it. And in webinars that we've talked before, the communications and things that go along with that are all important. But right now, it is the use of force. It is the de-escalation, the proportionality, all of these things are playing in. So these are amongst the things that we have to take a look at, that when we are actually on a deployment, did we utilize the dog correctly? Did we follow our department's use of force policy? So there's a lot of things that we have to look at. So I think Scott, who can't make it today, talks about, we have to remember one thing, it's that we are the ones who deploy the dog. It's us. So we have to have our things together. We have to have it ready in our mind. We have to be able to have our cover people there. We need to have the perimeters. We need to have all of those things that are there. And then we decide that we're going to deploy the dog based upon what? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, then if we are going to deploy, how are we going to deploy this? Do we have enough information that sets it out there that we are deploying properly? We are starting out properly. And as you talk about, Steve, all the time, tactical deployments and things like that are great to start out with, but upon first contact with the suspect, that could change, and most likely will, based upon what that person is giving us, either in his movements, or he's deciding not to talk or not to come out or not to do that, but we need to start thinking about all of those things. This is really, I think, part of the debrief, and we should always be thinking about such things. Anybody?
Who's up next?
Well, let's talk a little bit about California then. If nobody's going to say anything, maybe that'll jog some things and to let them know what's going on there if they haven't heard.
Well, should I talk about that at this time now, Don?
Yeah, I think so. I do. So maybe this will give some people some of the ideas of why we're talking about these things.
Well, we knew this was about to happen. We've been talking about it for many years now. We've seen it at various parts of the country, but California now, in our assembly, one of our newly elected assembly persons has introduced Assembly Bill 742. And the primary purpose of it is to prohibit the use of police service dogs to bite people. It will also prohibit them from being used in crowd control situations, which I don't disagree with, but I am very upset over the fact that they're trying to take away apprehension dogs. The ACLU, of course, is pushing this, and many civil rights organizations are supporting this proposed legislation. We, meaning the USPCA, will be filing a response to this proposed legislation. It is due by tomorrow evening, and we are working on that. But to give you a bit of background, the fact sheet that came out supporting this legislation states the following. The use of police canines has been a mainstay in this country's dehumanizing, cruel, and violent abuse of Black Americans and people of color for centuries. As noted by University of Michigan Law Journal, quote, whether extreme and violent or subtle and pervasive, the use of dogs in oppressive acts is a critical layer of racial bias in the United States that has consistently built injustices that impede social and legal progress, end of quote. And then it talks about how dogs are first used by slave catchers to apprehend fleeing slaves and brought back to the plantations. They are continuing that narrative over in this legislation, referring to it often and how dogs were misused during civil rights demonstrations back in the 60s and allegedly continuing up in today in responding to Black Lives Matter protests around the country. Therefore, the legislature has deemed it appropriate to now introduce legislation prohibiting the use of apprehension dogs. They cite California Department of Justice use of force data from 2021, saying injuries caused by police canines accounted for nearly 12% of cases that resulted in severe injury or death. And then they say nearly 2/3 of people seriously injured or killed by police canines were people of color. What's interesting, though, is I'm not aware of anybody died from police service dogs. In the history of police service dogs, I think there is obviously one or two, Robinette versus Barnes being the most notable case, and possibly 2 or 3 others directly caused by police service dogs. What I think we need to address in our letter, and I'll submit this to Steve, Lou, and Don, is that I think according to CDC, on the average, 10 to 12 people are killed per year by non-police dogs. Now, those include the very young and the very elderly, but I think it substantiates our argument that very rarely, if ever, is a police service dog going to cause the death of an individual. And certainly in California, I'm not aware of that happening. And I'm sure you know in your various states whether that has happened or not. So we need to bring that statistic out. Also, I am aware of in the 90s, I believe it was, the city of San Diego was experiencing a rash of officer-involved shootings, and the city conducted a study to see what they could do to reduce those officer-involved shootings. And they decided to increase their canine unit. And at one point, I think they had over 50 dogs as part of a patrol, and the number of officer-involved shootings dramatically declined, which seemed to support their hypothesis that the use of dogs would result in having to use deadly force less often. And I think we need to get some other statistics that would support that in this day and age. And I'm hoping other agencies have the same experience. I know the city of Fresno in Central California came out with a press release from their chief, and he said that eliminating the use of police service dogs is going to result in public safety being impacted. They talked about having strict deployment procedures, ensuring suspects are only wanted for dangerous crime, present a clear danger to the public or officers, and ample warnings are given to encourage the suspect to surrender and avoid being bitten by a dog. They talk about the Fresno Police Department has a bite ratio of less than 0.5%, 0.38% to be exact, of their entire deployment since January of 2022 to the present. And I think those are the kind of statistics that we need to put out there justifying the use of our police service dogs. I'm not surprised that this legislation is being advanced. We knew it was coming, but I think now we need to do whatever we can to help defeat this legislation, because then once it starts in California, it will spread north and eastward and south. Those are my thoughts initially.
Thanks, Gene. Steve?
Well, Gene, you laid out the threat from Assembly Bill 742 pretty clearly, and it's very similar to legislation that was proposed in Washington in 2020, the end of 2020 into 2021. And luckily, an education campaign persuaded the legislature to amend the law, and instead they created a committee to study it and get a better understanding so that legislators could make an informed decision about this. And it, it's one of those things that we have to realize is that's a function of Kaizen. That's a function of the legislature saying, do better. Every chance you get, everything you do, even if you did well, see if you can do better. And if anything will change this perception, it's if we as a community, as an industry, the police canine community makes this commitment to always doing better. If you make a mistake, own up, fess up, fix up, get it squared away, and take steps so that it doesn't happen again. If you see something that you're really, really good at, well, you shout that from the mountaintops. You get that low bite ratio like Fresno has out there for people to see. Like the document that Dave Furlan put out there and showed you that summary of the bill makes a point of pointing out that 67.5% of the time people with police canine bites go to the hospital. You want to know why that is? It's because law enforcement agencies, in doing their due diligence, say every bite goes to the hospital to get screened. There are agencies that do that. So as a result, that number doesn't take into account that people will go whether it's a scratch or whether it's something significant. And we need to go ahead and take those mischaracterizations. Maybe they're innocent mischaracterizations, or they could be very utilitarian mischaracterizations, and set the record straight about it. And there are a variety of things. We have to realize anybody that's an advocate for something will tend to characterize the exceptional as the ordinary. Take those events that are not representative of the way most canine deployments work out, that have maybe an unpleasant outcome, and then characterize that. And this is what's happening all the time, every day. You don't want this, do you? And then they will use that to kind of prod people into making emotional decisions rather than looking at this with the cool light of reason. And that's what we need to do. We need to give our legislators, anybody in California, anybody outside of California that has connections in California, get in touch with the assembly, let them know that there's more to this, and that the unintended impact of getting rid of patrol dogs is going to have a detrimental effect on public safety. These are the only tools in the police inventory, that will go from a local stop and rob to wherever that person is hiding under somebody's back deck 5 blocks away. That family in their house enjoying an evening dinner, watching TV, whatever, completely unaware that that person's there. And those suspects that we're looking for are desperate enough to break into somebody's house and hold them hostage until the police search is over. It has happened before, it'll happen again, and it's more likely to happen if we can get rid of the one tool we have that can most expeditiously locate those people so that we can make the safe arrest. There are all sorts of other things. You know, Gene pointed out the San Diego study. That was part of a holistic approach that San Diego made to change. Contact and cover came from that San Diego approach. But the impact of police dogs as a psychological deterrent to resistance was huge. And I think we need to examine that and remind Californians that you led the country in actually reducing police shootings. And a piece of that was by putting police dogs on the street. Taking them off will have the inverse effect. You don't want that.
Thanks, Steve. Did you want to say something, Lou?
I just wanted to let Gene know that I sent them an email on the wording of the AB 742. Anyway, it's just a comment, and I didn't want to make it public yet.
Okay. So this brings us back to the point of why we're giving this webinar, and for those of you that were here early and heard me talking with Steve and Lou about changing the focus of our information coming out to the membership in a way that it doesn't stop talking about training, but it starts talking about handler intelligence on dog training and deployments, and trying to get everyone up into that trainer's kind of a mode where we are suggesting that you can't simply wait for someone to come and help you train. You have to start trying to do some things yourself. You need to understand how dogs are trained, and we will start putting those out in the newsletters and such, so that we can be better. But it's definitely handler deployments that you need to understand, and that's why we debrief everything. It usually is informal. If we had a K9 program and we did ours informally, with the trainers, we had a sergeant and a trainer attend or be there for every bite, and we assessed and we went over the operation right then and there to see how we needed to make changes. Supervisor would then say, well, we need to actually get into the office and we need to start another training program or as such. So it's important. We need to make it. I will stop saying that. So go ahead. Anybody wants, if that's it.
Can I ask the others that are in this meeting if they just give us a geographical area where they live and what the temperature is like in regards to, do you have similar legislation that might be proposed? Are there similar sentiments in your area about discontinuing canines like this? I didn't know if you could kind of give us a temperature reading in your area to see if California is in line with what's going on, or are they kind of like way ahead of the curve, or trying to repeat what Washington did a couple of years ago?
Hi, this is Mark, Irresistible Sergeant over at the University of South Florida Police Department in Tampa, Florida. And I have not heard of anything similar to this in the state of Florida, obviously, but it's shocking to hear about California.
Hi, this is Tom Healy in Colorado, and have not heard anything specifically about this. Colorado is a funny state. We've got pockets of very conservative individuals where there's lots of police support. And then there's the city and county of Denver, the Metro Denver area, where it's much different. Nothing specifically about canines here, and not any anti-law enforcement legislation that I'm aware of in this session. But we do have an entirely Democratic legislature and government, actually, both houses of the legislature as well as the governor. So it would be something to be wary of.
Yeah, how's it going, guys? I work in the private sector, so it really doesn't apply to me, but I live in New York, and I'm sure New York is right. It's going to follow California.
Now, unfortunately, you're probably right. I mean, and, I think Tom brought up something that Colorado is a state like many others where you have a broad, broad section geographically of the state that it tends to be conservative, but the urban centers tend to be liberal, tend to be run by the Democrat Party, whether it's irrelevant that the cultures are different in between the urban centers and the rural areas, the suburban areas. And that's the reality of the way this country looks right now. And unfortunately, urban centers tend to have a lot more sway. And we have to realize that, and that they're going to do the things we talked about, that those who have an agenda against the police are going to use whatever tool they can. And the police dogs are just happen to be a focal point that's easy for them to come after right now. And there's a concerted effort. It's a concerted national effort. This brings back the ACLU challenges we faced in the 90s. Gene and I were both around for those things, and they weren't fun, but we prevailed. And we can prevail again if we do due diligence, if we do our homework. But thanks for being there, John. Appreciate it. You up now, Randall?
Looks like he's got his comments in the chat. And those who don't have the chat, I'll read it. It says, I've heard of the California legislation. We've been watching this. If California does it, we will also. And he's in New York.
And Don, perhaps we can make the fact sheet that I shared with you this morning available to members of the USPCA so they understand what is being pursued and what the genesis of this legislation is and what they're basing it on.
Absolutely. That's easily done. And I can do that. I don't know if there's any other questions on the process of debrief or such. We should get those in if we can. If not,
I'm just going to say everything circles back to that process.
mhm.
If we, as an industry, get in the habit of always looking at how we can continue to improve, the problematic incidents should reduce. The ones that can, those exceptional incidents that can be used as fodder by portraying them as commonplace will become fewer and fewer in number. We become a harder target to hit in that way. And so it's just about really all of us committing to always doing it good and then doing it better the next time.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for your presentation. I appreciate it. Thank you for attending and with your comments. And we don't appreciate the fact that you're listening, but we also appreciate the fact that we're trying to do something to make it better. And this happened a year and a half ago in New Jersey also, where they wanted to do this, and we were able to stop doing this and wrote letters and had some other interested help from other large organizations. So we're out there trying to fight this, but we have to make sure that you are taking care of everything you're supposed to be taking care of. So with that said, I would just say that's a wrap, and we'll put this up in a couple of days on YouTube for you guys to look at if you need to. Thank you very much for attending.